Is that working okay for everyone? Can you see my slideshow? Yes, okay, great, thank you. Hi, so yeah, as Nandita said, my name is Amy Keating. I'm a PhD candidate at Western University. My title is Finding a Queer Sense of Belonging Through Live Performance Art. So, so even amidst the burgeoning of mainstream queerness, I find myself as a queer subject searching for a moment in time and space that allows my embodied tension to dissipate. Live performances, I suggest, contain the possibility for queers to exist comfortably to feel what I call a queer sense of belonging. Art can do this through the illumination of components that revalue our notions of temporality by eschewing North American chrononormativity. So in this paper, I argue that our current chrononormative frameworks have visceral implications upon queer bodies, and that queer performance art allows for the possibility for our bodies to feel at ease. I borrowed the term chrononormativity from Elizabeth Freeman and used this definition to explore the ways a capitalist and heteronormative society can manifest in queer embodiment through auto-ethnographic and affective reflection. I illustrate a concert I had the privilege of attending in Brooklyn, New York in the summer of 2019 as being an example of a space through artistic media that revalues temporality in a way that is coherent to queer subjects. And of course, this was all pre-COVID, and I haven't really looked too deeply into how live performance has changed so much. I mean, a lot of things are being held virtually, which would be another interesting facet of this project overall. So I look at a band, they're called Hunks and His Punks. I argue that they embodied DIY aesthetics and a lyrical narration of past trauma, as well as effeminate body language, providing what theorist Jacqueline Pryor calls time slips, which then give us an opportunity to rid our bodies of the bind of chrononormativity and momentarily feel a queer sense of belonging. So I suggest that queer subjects experience a discordance within our context of chrononormativity, creating a feeling of being outcast. Freeman conceptualizes chrononormativity as the dominant ways in which our contexts are structured, giving specific value to temporal rhythms. Excuse me. For Freeman, chrononormativity has visceral profundity as it binds our very flesh. She concludes that a chrononormative timeline in North America is an ideal that requires heteronormativity and participation in hyperproductive capitalism. The path connecting temporal organization to our bodies through capitalism and hyperproductivity seems pretty straightforward, but the connection to heteronormativity is also equally fundamental. So Freeman traces how heterotime became essential to organizing dutiful citizens. She shows this through the advent of photography as it progressed and became more widely available to the middle class. So a chrononormative temporal rhythm values and prioritizes economical production alongside reproduction, fostered directly through productivity. This is also seen as we move along the straight path Sarah Ahmed describes throughout her conception of queer phenomenology. This path is marked by events steeped in heteronormativity and capitalist notions, such as marriage, an acceptable job, children. Any deviation from this path is queer and can be sort of a queer timeline. So the value of time in art is made explicit through the work of Jacqueline Pryor's Time Slips. By analyzing and contextualizing case studies, she argues for the value of queer performance as resignifying our relationship with time, thus exposing the inequalities of systems that impose traumas and harm. It is through these queer times that we can find ways of healing by virtue of attending to a trauma from which marginalized groups are so often told to move on. Sorry, I need to emphasize that. Thus, by allowing what she calls time slips, there is time to dwell on these injuries while obtaining validation from others that is not granted by regular chrononormative timelines. I believe this happened during the queercore concert. So this is a picture of the band Hunks and His Punks, and they're fronted by queer multimedia artist Seth Bogart. They played a sold-out show at Elsewhere Space in Brooklyn, New York in the summer of 2019. So Bogart sauntered onto the stage in full pleather and black sunglasses, not unlike what he's wearing in this photo there. His jacket had been hand-painted. His punks were in similar outfits that included lots of pleather, leather, patches, and refashioned garments. Performers and audience members screamed and laughed along to a lot of the campy lyrics. We watched him drink a beer and rip off his pleather pants to reveal a leopard print thong. At one point, he asked the crowd, "Who here is queer?" which is unusual for most regular spaces, but at the time, everyone in the crowd responded with screams of excited affirmation. So they played many of their hits, and I'm going to focus as well on one particular song, which, pardon my profanity, the song's title is "Everyone's a Pussy, Fuck You Dude," which is very relevant, and I'll get into that later. And the lyrics are only that title, sort of screamed, sung multiple times. So I argue that these elements of performance facilitated stepping outside of the queer discordances of chrononormativity. So I also consider the visual aesthetics. So queercore developed as a reaction to the evolution of punk music as it kind of became more exclusionary. Like punk broadly, it disdained industrialism, capitalism, authority, and mainstream success, but they particularly targeted heteronormativity and normative gender roles. Queercore artists pride themselves in DIY culture regardless of skill and resources, making the means of creation and publishing available to the masses. So much of this aesthetic is the look of sort of salvaging and repurposing refuse of the working class, that is, reusing the waste of capitalism and creating modes of low barrier participation. So the band's DIY and punk aesthetic is not only anti-capitalist in its message, but in its production. So handmade decorated pieces, such as those worn by the group, discourage buying everything brand new and also encourage taking way too much time on a singular garment. An original, painstakingly done piece of clothing done by oneself is defiant against the forward march of chrononormativity. So therefore, maybe a deviant queer might find some solace in this moment and space. So alongside the visual aesthetics of the performing band, I turned to the lyrics of one of the performed songs, "Everyone's a Pussy, Fuck You Dude." So the 30-second piece is simply the singing of its title over harsh punk instrumentals. It was because of the queercore nature and the presumption that most participants identified with queerness in some capacity, there's a shared history that we bring forth. Cultural theorist Lisa Blackman argues that both participants and performers bring forth their subjectivity to the experience. As such, we are converging on a timeline where we connect with one another. She writes that, quote, "The performer is not simply expressing their own symptoms, but is connected to shared history or counter memory that exists intergenerationally and is felt intercorporeally. I suggest that the shared history that we experience simultaneously is present during the song and engaged with by all participants. I, as a participant myself, I attached a meaning to it that comes from my own relational knowing and experience as a queer person. I understand and have felt the policing of gender nonconformity on a visceral plane. And I can imagine a young Seth Bogart walking in a queer manner, speaking with a feminine lilt, being the object of bullies at any age, calling him this misogynistic and sissy-phobic slur. So in this concert, however, he is screaming in the foreground of a punk song in the face of his bullies whilst walking effeminately to a crowd of queer celebrating. Embodying this campiness in a space that where it is valued by participants reconstitutes a relationship with our bodies and one another in that we might feel at ease. We realize that we can strut in a way that defies notions of gender or sexuality as heteronormative or gender normative. This embodiment also has a temporal balance in that we stutter and flit around so as not to walk on a straight line. Bogart is challenging bodily efficiency along with challenging gender norms. To move excessively and with exaggeration is to deviate from the norm of straightness and onto another queer path. In this specific moment, we are valuing a queer timeline. So just to sum up, by valuing taking too much time and deviating from straight lines, I'm arguing that this performance palpably concocted a queer timeline. Rather than contorting to fit into the constraints of conventional temporality, this sense of relief and celebration of these elements provides for its queer participants a potential sense of belonging. We are referring to a shared history by taking part in and relating to his songs and attire and body language. We are all participating, and despite our differing subjective threads, there are symptoms that we share and thus recreate in the moment. I am concluding that my reflection of this concert highlighted how I felt as though I belonged, which stands in stark contrast to many of us who feel as though we stick out or fail or cannot keep up with everyone else. And then my references. So thank you so much.